Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What is the United Nations doing to eliminate the scourge of war, to promote economic and social development, and to enhance human rights? How do many of the United Nations programs impact all 7 billion people on the planet? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Global Connections Television is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guests. Today, we're going to have a bit of a different type of program. Normally, it's an interview with a special guest, but today, we're going to do a tour of the United Nations. And the United Nations is an agency that impacts all of our lives. In some cases, we're aware of it. In some cases, we're not. We have some slides, and these are really historic, vintage slides from the early 1980s, not a slick PowerPoint presentation. And we're going to do a quick walkthrough of the United Nations. In fact, it might be a whirlwind tour of the UN, but we'll focus a little bit on the history of the United Nations, some of the key agencies, to talk about how broad the UN's activities are and how many of these we never hear much about. Some we do hear about, but others very, very seldom. But let's jump into the slideshow and start with the first one. The first slide shows bombed out Warsaw, Poland. And of course, we saw after World War II, Europe lay in ruins, parts of Asia had been destroyed. Over 60 million people died in World War II. When the leaders of the world gathered in San Francisco, California to sign the UN Charter on June 26, 1945, they knew they needed to bring together leaders who could work together to try to really reduce friction, to promote world peace, and to solve their problems under one roof and not do them on the battlefields as they had in World War II and in World War I. Former President Franklin Roosevelt was one of the key architects of the United Nations. When the atomic weapons were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the leaders of the world knew that if with this type of atomic energy were used in the future, it would be absolutely devastating. Albert Einstein once said that if we fought World War III with atomic or nuclear weapons, we'd be fighting World War IV with sticks and stones because of the devastation that would take place. There are 6 organs of the United Nations. The first organ is the UN General Assembly. The General Assembly is sort of the meeting hall of the world. All 193 countries of the world are represented in the General Assembly. They come together to focus on issues that are of importance to the people in their countries. There are votes on resolutions, but these are non-binding resolutions. A second organ of the United Nations is the Security Council. The Security Council is the most important and the most powerful of the 6 organs of the United Nations. During the Cold War, from about 1946 through the late 80s, the Cold War was fought in the Security Council. Not much was accomplished, but after the early 90s, you saw that the Security Council was coming online. It was starting to work in a more cooperative rather than confrontational approach. Again, today, all of the countries do not agree on every resolution that comes before the Security Council, but they're cooperating much more than they did 15, 20, 30, 40 years ago. There are 15 members of the Security Council. 5 are permanent members, which means that they can veto the resolutions. Anyone can veto a resolution from the Security Council. They're the United States, Russia, China, the United Kingdom, and France. There are 10 rotating members who serve 2-year terms. When the Security Council does vote on a resolution, it is binding on the country or countries that it's applied against. The International Court of Justice is located in The Hague, and this is a court that if 2 countries are unable to resolve their problems, if they mutually agree to abide by the decision of the court, they can take the issue to the court, which has 15 members. The fourth organ of the United Nations is the Trusteeship Council, and the Trusteeship Council is probably one of the most successful parts of the UN system. It basically worked with countries that were coming out from under colonial rule and helped them to determine their own destinies. The Trusteeship Council has just about worked itself out of a job. It's been very effective, and there are basically no trustees left. The Economic and Social Council, commonly called ECOSOC, is one that is very, very important. And most of the programs I'm going to talk about today tie into ECOSOC, so I won't spend much time on that right now. The sixth organ of the United Nations is the Secretariat, and these are really the international civil servants, also called international public administrators, who work with the United Nations. There are about 70,000 more or less who carry out the programs of the United Nations. The Chief Executive Officer, or Secretary General of the United Nations, is the administrator, the primary administrator. The first was Trygve Lie, a Norwegian national. Today, Ban Ki-moon is the 8th Secretary General of the UN. When we think of the United Nations, we often think of peacekeeping, and there are right now about 120,000 peacekeepers in some very dangerous areas of the world, the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Darfur, and a variety of other places. There are approximately 15 peacekeeping missions, and they are in place to try to promote stability in an area and to help the people to develop their lives and to get their lives back on track in a peaceful way. In 1988, the peacekeepers won the Nobel Peace Prize. This baby in Bhutan, I'm not sure who's suffering more, the mother or the baby, but the UN World Health Organization is a frontline agency that works to combat diseases regardless of where they are in the world. The World Health Organization has teamed up with Rotary International and with the UN Children's Fund, UNICEF, to head up the largest international health program in the world, and that's to combat polio and other childhood diseases. The Food and Agriculture Organization helps farmers, such as the Sri Lankan farmer, to develop his produce better, to develop better agricultural practices, and also to help distribute it around the world. Youth are a very important part of many of the United Nations activities, and the UN works with the various governments and other groups to work on programs to help youth to move away from drugs. Also, there's been a tremendous movement among youth in various areas of the world to team up to help achieve the United Nations Millennium Development Goals, to reduce abject poverty by 50%, to promote universal primary school education, to empower women, to reduce infant and maternal mortality rates, to reverse the AIDS pandemic, to promote sustainable development, and also to promote international cooperation. 1981 was declared by the UN General Assembly as the International Year of the Disabled, again to focus attention on problems that affect the disabled. The UN reported recently that we're almost at 1 billion people who are 60 and above, and of course they have special needs that are being dealt with by various governments around the world and by other institutions. Women are a critical part of the United Nations. Almost every UN program has some component that's working to empower women, and of course that's the third Millennium Development Goal. It's very interesting to look at some of the statistics. If you look at the developed countries, economically developed countries, there are situations or problems with women hitting glass ceilings, such as in the corporate world, they're unable to advance. But if we look at also the economically developing countries, some of the statistics from a few years ago were really eye-opening. 1 out of every 3 families is headed by a female. Women do 75% of the work, of the labor in the country, and women earn 1/10 of what men earn and own 1/100th of the property. So you can see there's a tremendous imbalance as to what women do provide, and they're a key component in every society, in every family, and also what their financial remuneration is. The United Nations has done a variety of things, such as having a major conference in 1995, the UN Conference on Women in Beijing, China. Also, the UN Women's Group was set up. So the UN is focusing on women and helping to empower them. Usually you become a refugee, such as the people in this Lebanese camp, either one of 2 ways, either through war, or it may be that the climate is changing. And we know that the climate is changing. The scientific data report that and substantiate it. It is very difficult when people see the desertification taking place, their livestock is dying, the grass is not growing, they're unable to maintain themselves, so they're on the move. The UN High Commission on Refugees this year is working with over 30 million refugees to help them stay in their area and to just have a basic minimal standard of living until they can return to their homes. This is a shot of an apartheid beach in South Africa. The United Nations was one of the first organizations to go online opposing apartheid, the forced separation of races in South Africa. We see today that there have been several all free democratic elections held in that country, as in many other countries in Africa. If there is a typhoon in the Philippines, or perhaps an earthquake such as this one in Guatemala City, or the horrific earthquake that hit Port-au-Prince, Haiti, the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs is available to come in to help to coordinate much of the relief activity. UNICEF, the UN Children's Fund, this is probably the best known of all the United Nations agencies. They do a variety of things such as work on maternal and child health care programs, but also provide potable water. I mentioned earlier they were involved with Rotary International and the UN World Health Organization to combat polio. This was a program launched by Rotary in 1985. The UN came in around 1987, and it's really on track to abolish this horrific disease of polio, which, when it takes place, will save over 50,000 children's lives every year. Millions of others will not suffer from this dreaded disease. The taxpayers of the world will save $1.5 billion a year that they won't have to spend on anti-polio programs. So it's a major, major project that's just very close to being accomplished. Now, the slides I'm going to talk about now and the agencies we've probably not heard much about. The United Nations is not going into outer space, won't be sending shuttles into outer space, but it does provide a basic service as far as bringing the countries of the world together to, first off, to develop agreements on how to develop outer space, how to develop it peacefully, and also to make sure that there are not nuclear weapons that are put into outer space. A second challenge for the United Nations is to get the countries to focus on space junk. There's a lot of space debris that's out there that is floating around, nuts, bolts, that type of thing. And it is important to get this stuff and to clean it up because it can be very dangerous for any future space travel. If you're watching the weather report tonight, you might just keep in mind that it's the United Nations World Meteorological Organization that helps disseminate weather information around the world. This is a shot of the Tarbala Dam project that was done several decades ago in Pakistan by the World Bank primarily. And this was a very important project for several reasons. One, it was creating a dam that would prevent future flooding in that area of the world. It would also provide electrical energy to the people in that area. It was providing employment to many of the people who worked on the Tarbala Dam. This is a very important project. This would be called a mega project. Today, a lot of the organizations such as the World Bank and other development organizations are looking at these mega projects and looking at how maybe it might be better to do more micro projects and some that are more environmentally friendly. Climate change is occurring. Pollution is a major problem. Pollution knows no boundaries. It crosses state lines, provincial lines, regional lines, national lines, wherever it wants to go, it will go. And this is really one of the major challenges that we have today. In fact, climate change may be the #1 challenge. And of course, with over 7 billion people on the planet, we're helping to contribute to this. The United Nations has undertaken many activities to focus attention on this. One was to create the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 1988, which has produced, I think, around five major scientific studies identifying that climate change is occurring and that humans are very involved in contributing to climate change. In 1992, there was a major conference, UN Conference on Environment and Development in Rio de Janeiro. And of course, that focused on sustainable development, which was sort of a concept that we're using now. It's in the vocabulary, and it's one that's very important that people talk about quite a bit on how we can preserve our fragile resources, but still not destroy the earth in the process. Another is Agenda 21, which is sort of a blueprint, 900-page blueprint on how you can conserve energy. Many businesses thought it was a very good idea to use Agenda 21. It saved them a lot of money, and they helped reduce a lot of pollution and to really make the fragile planet more environmentally friendly. In 2012, we saw another major conference. There have been several major conferences, but one that was held again, Rio Plus 20 in Rio de Janeiro, was the UN Conference on Sustainable Development. Again, this focused attention on how we can bring the world together, how they can come together to focus on climate change. And there were many good ideas that came out of the UN Conference on Sustainable Development. If you've ever flown overseas, or if you've ever shipped a package by air, it's the United Nations International Civil Aviation Organization that brings together the airlines of the world, the governments of the world, to develop rules and regulations so that air traffic you can have safe air traffic in international airspace. There's also inherent in this a mandate to work against terrorism in airplanes and in airports. There's also a United Nations agency, the International Maritime Organization, which basically performs the same functions for the ship lines of the world, bringing them together to develop the safety standards to move ships on the high seas and also to combat piracy. If you think of UNESCO, the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, you think of illiteracy programs, which is very important, but also UNESCO has a broader mandate. They have one program that we don't hear much about. It's the Man in the Biosphere program. And basically, if you have a pristine natural resource, such as Mammoth Cave in Kentucky or the Everglades in Florida, if the local leaders want, they can apply to UNESCO, and UNESCO will come in and help them to develop a strategy that will allow them to preserve that pristine natural resource, but also to have it as a revenue producing agent so that you can make money off of it, but still not destroy it in the process. These children who are working in this brick factory in Southern Asia are earning the not so princely sum of about 6 cents a day. You can see that their human rights are being violated. And of course, when Eleanor Roosevelt, who was very instrumental in helping to usher or chauffeur the Universal Declaration on Human Rights through the UN General Assembly in 1948, I'm sure she thought about the 60 million people who died in World War II and literally the hundreds of millions more who were dispossessed. But she probably thought about these children and how important it was to help preserve their human rights. And that's one of the reasons the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted. It's sort of a blueprint, a Bill of Rights for countries, especially those who don't have their own constitutions perhaps, to focus attention on how they can help preserve the human rights of the people who live within their borders. The UN has done a variety of other things to promote this, such as developing the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and various programs work in this area. The UN is able to do a variety of things, and one thing that it has done very well is to come in as sort of a neutral broker, if you will, and help countries who, for example, if there's a country in the South Pacific that's coming out from under the trusteeship and wants to develop its own form of government and chart its own future, or if it wants to go, or if it could come into a country such as Colombia or to Cambodia, El Salvador, Haiti, wherever it might be, to help set up free democratic elections. And this is a function that the UN can do because it comes in, as I mentioned, as that neutral broker. It doesn't take sides in the election, but works with both or all parties to set up the process so that the people can democratically decide who they want to be their elected representatives and how they want to develop their own particular future. These are just a few of the slides that are a few of the United Nations agencies that we've had a chance to talk about today. To go into great detail, we could spend hours on each of the agencies and many of the programs, but I just want to give you a flavor of some of the depth of the United Nations, the breadth of the United Nations, and some of the programs. If we had more time today, we could have talked about perhaps the Universal Postal Union, that if you're sending a letter overseas or a package overseas to Tokyo or to La Paz or wherever it might be, that it's the Universal Postal Union that brings the government's postal authorities together to develop the rules and regulations to move the mail safely around the world. The International Atomic Energy Agency, which is very involved in working with countries such as North Korea or Iran or others to try to promote the peaceful use of nuclear energy. You have a variety of other United Nations agencies, the World Intellectual Property Organization, and of course that's one that is of great interest to countries such as the United States, developed countries, ones who have patents. But there's a whole family, a whole group of United Nations agencies that work to make this a better world, and so often we don't read about them. We hear a lot about perhaps the UN Security Council, UN peacekeeping. Those are all very important. But again, there are many other agencies. About 80% of the UN system is involved in providing humanitarian and other types of assistance to people around the world. There are a lot of issues about the United Nations too that we hear about that are sometimes accurate and sometimes they're not. The UN is located on the East River. The main headquarters is in New York City. And we often hear people say, well, the United Nations is undermining our sovereignty. Well, that's not true. The UN does not undermine the sovereignty of the various governments. The governments come together and collectively agree or disagree to work on a particular problem. It's not one that's forced on them. The United Nations is not a supranational organization that has immense power that can just wreak havoc whenever it would like. It is an organization of 193 countries that come together to agree on these particular issues. We often hear too that I mentioned earlier about the Man in the Biosphere program, about how the UN can come in to work with organizations in a particular state or a particular country or whatever to preserve a pristine natural resource, and also historic sites. They work on those. But again, they come in and they do not control those sites. They work in partnership with the organizations, with the people in that area, and it's really the people in the area who decide how they want to move forward on preserving these. There's also a myth out there that the United Nations has a very large budget. It's often been said that the budget of the UN Secretariat is smaller than the fire department budget in the city of New York. So when you put it in comparison or in perspective, the UN does not, and generally speaking, have a huge amount of money. But as with all organizations, the UN is looking to use that money more efficiently and more effectively, as it should. And it has become much more efficient over the past, at least the past 12 years or so. So there are a lot of activities that are underway at the UN to make it a more effective organization. There are, again, many other items that we could have talked about today that we've not had a chance to do. But it's often been said that the United Nations, if it did not exist, would have to be created. If it went out of business today, we would have to create the United Nations tomorrow. And that is true. It is still the only international organization that brings the countries of the world together under one roof so that they can focus upon their problems. In many cases, they will agree on how to deal with a particular problem, but you can just imagine if the United Nations did not bring these countries together. If we just take one example, I mentioned earlier about the Civil Aviation Organization and how it works with airlines around the world. Just imagine if aircraft or airlines had to deal individually or on a bilateral basis with each country, say, for example, a Lufthansa or Air India or Delta or whatever the airline might be, and had to deal with these countries and work up their own agreements and work up their own negotiations. And in many cases, they have to do much of this. But still, if you have some standardized rules and regulations that apply to airlines and to countries, it works so much more smoothly than if you had them having to work on a particular set of regulations. In fact, it would be so confusing that probably the pilots couldn't get into the cockpits because there'd be so many rules and regulations. But it takes a group, an organization like the United Nations, to come together and to bring these countries together to try to deal with these problems. And of course, it's in our best interest to learn more about the United Nations. And of course, what we try to do with Global Connections Television is to focus attention on these international issues and to look at how international issues impact the people not only in the United States but all around the world. And from time to time, we take a look at organizations such as the United Nations, as well as other organizations that are out there working to deal with many of these problems. And it's, as I mentioned, in our best interest to learn more about the United Nations. And there are various ways we can do this. We can obviously Google if we see a particular conference that's going on dealing with AIDS or perhaps the illegal flow of drugs or human trafficking. We can Google that. We can also go to un.org, which lists not only the programs I've mentioned today, but a variety of other programs to get more information about them. And one good way is to go to unfoundation.org. You can go to unfoundation.org and sign up to receive a daily update of about 15 to 20 different articles, not on just the United Nations, but on other international issues that will focus on what the organizations doing or how other groups are dealing with these international problems. But we need to reach out beyond the traditional media. The media do not, generally speaking, cover the UN in great detail. But this is just one approach to learning more about the United Nations. It's a little bit of a different program, but I want to thank you so very much for joining me today on Global Connections Television.